अनि सबै पार्टिसिपेन्ट्सहरुलाई चाहिँ आफ्नो माइक म्युट गरेर राख्दिनु भन्न चाहन्छु so that disturbance नहोस् भनेर
सुरु गरौँ
सुरु गर्दै गरे हुन्छ ब्रो मैले रेकर्डिङ स्टार्ट गरिदिसके अब लाइभ पनि गइहाल्यो
हुन्छ सबैजनालाई जो पनि हुनुहुन्छ I would like to welcome to our webinar अनि good afternoon everyone it's me Sumana Lammichhane one of the board of the director of PowerChef Nepal सबैजनाले एकछिन माइक म्युट गरिदिनु होला डिस्टर्बेन्स आइरहेछ I'd like to start again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sumana Lammichhane. I'm one of the board of the director of the PowerChef Nepal, and I also coordinate the communication part of the organization. Before starting the session, I would like to give a short introduction about PowerChef Nepal. PowerChef Nepal, it is one of the youth-led organization and especially focused on the local issue with consideration of the global perspective, climate change, and various other environmental issues with the aim to raise the voice against the action and also aspire the young people, especially the female leaders. It also works on the philosophy of the knowledge, action, and the promotion, where youth, young youth, especially the female youth, gain the knowledge on climate change and related environmental issue, along with the possible solution. Also, till now, we have already PowerChef more than 100 of the youth and also 1,000 of the children, directly or indirectly, and also large number of the mass of the people through the online and organization. And PowerChef Nepal has been organizing a knowledge networking series where it themes knowledge networking, be inspiration, get inspired. In this session, we are doing different webinar time and again. So escape part macha, today we are doing the webinar as on the topic of reclaiming narratives, feminist leadership and climate justice. अनि आजको यो प्रोग्राम वेबिनारको लागि चाहिँ हाम्रो स्पिकर हुनुहुन्छ Miss Kripa Basnyat. I'd like to welcome her to today's webinar and also we are very thankful for your presence. And Kripa Basnyat, talking about the Kripa Basnyat, she is one of the intersectional feminists with more than 10 years of experience on working on peace building and reconciliation. And she has been working on economic, social, and the cultural rights, gender equality, and social inclusion through research and policy advocacy, also leadership development and capacity strengthening. She is also the co-founder of Reclaiming Narratives, which is an intersectional feminist collective in Nepal. Kripaji recently completed her M.Sc in Inequalities and Social Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And she has experience of working with the Feminist and Human Rights International Development Organization, regional networks, and academic institutions in South Asia, East Asia, and UK. She is the Atlantic Senior Fellow for the Social and Economic Equality and founding member of the South Asian Feminist Alliance on Economic, Social, and the Cultural Rights. Without any further delay, now I'd like to hand over the session to the Kripaji.
Thank you so much, Sumana, for the introduction. And I think like we are there to start, start गर्नको लागि चाहिँ मेरो एउटा छोटो presentation चाहिँ छ. I think like I'll simultaneously share what's there in this presentation and what I have to share about feminist leadership in climate justice. Actually, Sumana screen share गरिदिनुहुन्छ कि?
Who is host here? Host disabled participants screen sharing भन्नुभएको छ. एकचोटि मलाई होस्ट गरिदिनु.
So I can start. Meanwhile, to the Gorsa,
Yeah, Sumana, you can share.
What?
Screen share भयो.
I think I'll continue rather than wasting time. Paula Suruta, I think, I would like to thank you everyone for coming. And I'm really thrilled to be here, in fact, for this virtual interaction in Femmes Leadership and Climate Justice. Like Sumana shared, I represent this intersectional feminist collective called Reclaiming Narratives. So the whole point of our existence was also to challenge the dominant narrative around feminist leadership, and how patriarchy has been operationalized, how Brahminical patriarchy has been operationalized. And we do this through basically feminist participatory research and advocacy, feminist knowledge production, pedagogy, and finally invest in cross-movement collaborations. So even while interacting here, I think it's important for us to see how we can converge and collaborate further in future as well. So the issue that we're going to talk today is really important and timely, I feel. And it's really necessary, considering that we are sitting on this ticking time bomb, right? So if we do not take substantial actions and steps, our future is going to explode. It's going to be explosive, but in a bad way. And I'm sure we don't want that to happen, right? So going to slide number 2, if you look at the pictures in slide 2, Sumana, can you change the slide? What we can also see is that there are climate change denials, who deny that, okay, climate change is a hoax, it's not happening. But COVID-19 has actually exposed the existing gaps in our systems. Though COVID-19 has brought the whole economic system to a halt, we should not forget that care economy has actually sustained the world, right? So even if you look at our health professionals, be it care workers looking after people with disability, be it looking after elderly people, at the moment, the whole world is actually sustained by this care economy. And we can already see the flaws in our economic system, right? And then it actually questions us if we have considered to bring care at the center of our own operationalization. So, so far, if you see, there has been quick fixes, there's been, attempt to put band-aids to address climate change, and which has actually led to climate crisis now, right? So we've started using this word called climate crisis rather than using climate change to address that. Okay, this is urgent. This needs immediate attention. So I say that this is just not a problem connected with environment, or it's just an environmental crisis, but this is also a larger political and leadership problem that we can see, right? So there's this inability to look at intersectional aspects of climate issues and structural violence in the form of patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism that has led to deepening the existing inequalities. So in slide 3, if you see, in today's session, I want to basically deconstruct the concept of feminist leadership. And we break that into 4 components, basically looking at the concept of feminist leadership and further unpack it to understand what all are the core components of the feminist leadership, and see where basically it occurs, what are the locations of its size, and what does it look like in practice. So I'll basically base it in the context of climate justice, but I think there needs to be a disclaimer saying that I'm not an expert in climate justice. I have worked in exercising, in operationalizing feminist leadership in different capacities, in different spaces. So basically this can be operationalized in any field, right? be it climate justice, be it violence against women, be it any other sector that you're working on. So I think like this, it is particularly important to understand what transformational feminist leadership is all about. And this work basically is inspired by the work done by Srilata Batliwala, where she has done decades long of activism around leadership, where she has interacted with different recognized feminist leaders, and through her interaction and through the reflections of these particular leaders, there was this toolkit on transformative feminist leadership, where these concepts are basically it is broken down. So you might find it useful to then go back to the document afterwards if you're interested. So going further, so basically, what does feminist leadership mean, right? So even within that, we're talking about transformative feminist leadership. So going to the next slide, Sumana. When we talk about transformative leadership, we need to be aware that leadership is basically basically just a means or a vehicle, but not an end in itself. So that is what we need to know, right? So next slide. And what it also reminds us is that we need to move from this like whole concept of defining what just leadership is, and go further down and understand what feminist leadership should be like, in practice. And when we talk about TFL, it also means capacitating, to lead differently with feminist values and ideologies to advance the agenda of feminist social transformation. So even if you look at the picture, there might be a woman with her invisible cape, and we might even know it, and or we don't even consider her as a leader or as a feminist leader, right? So there's also an image of what a leader looks like in our head, and that needs to be basically shattered and dismantled, right? If we are going to practice transformative feminist leadership. So going to another slide, slide 6. So there are a few feminists who have shared their thoughts in terms of what feminist leadership is, where Bernice Lott has said that, it's really important to make the distinction between feminine and feminist leadership, because when we talk about feminine leadership, it does not really engage with gender power relations, women's lack of access to form a position of authority. So, we need to make that distinction and understand ourselves. So another recognized feminist, Charlotte Bunch, like what she has said, is that, we also need to look at the difference between women's leadership and feminist leadership. Those two are different things. But why we say that is that feminist leadership particularly has a political standpoint. And, even if like women have led, if you look at the past movement, in current movement, their leadership is not really recognized. So already a problem that we can see, right? And in terms of Peggy Antrobus, like she has raised an important points of how we can build feminist leadership, how this work can happen at two different levels. The first one is to build women's self-esteem in order to strengthen their leadership. And the second one is to basically give women, the skills, resources, access to decision-making. And in a way that would help them have more power to make a difference in their own communities, right? So basically leadership for change. And what we need to be mindful of is when we are building collective leadership, it should be a collective leadership, right? Rather than creating individual heroines. Why I say that is that, in those contexts, in those situations, in those scenarios, they can easily, succumb to the politics of domination and control. So there is power in collective in itself. So when we talk about definition, this is more of a dynamic definition. It has evolved over the period of years, and this is not the exhaustive definition that you can find, right? But I think the way it is evolved and the way defined by Kriya, by Srilata Batliwala, is that women and men with feminist vision of social justice individually, collectively transforming themselves, their organizations, their movements to pay close attention to gender power structures and discriminatory practices, both formal and informal, in order to advance gender equality within their organizations and social movements, as well as in the communities and constituencies that they serve. So this is like one of the definitions we've come across, and you might come across other definitions as well. But this sounds a more nuanced form of defining a transformative feminist leadership. So now let's look at what falls within transformative feminist leadership. So going to the next slide, what we can see is that we can see the feminist leadership diamond, where can you go to the next slide, please? So so the next slide, thank you. So when we look at the picture, what we can see here is this is a feminist leadership diamond that we can see. And this basically consists of 4 components, 4 P's that we say it basically captures power, politics and purpose, principles and values, and the 4th one is practices. So we also call these 4 P's feminist leadership diamond. And going to another slide, I think it's important for us to now deconstruct what power basically means, right? So when we look at power within leadership, it's important to learn that leadership is about holding power, exercising power, changing the distribution and relations of power in different forms, in different settings. And basically, feminist leadership will try to make the practice of power more visible, more democratic, legitimate, and accountable at all levels, and be it in both the realms, like private or public realms. And when we talk about power, I think what we need to understand is when we exercise, leadership development practices in our own field areas, do we practice power analysis is the question that we should ask ourselves. If we don't, then we should start doing that. And particularly, this is what I'm going to share. But these are different facets, different aspects of power that we need to be aware of if we're going to practice feminist leadership, right? So when we're talking about realms of power, how power manifests in itself, is that it is divided into 3 aspects: the public, the private, and the intimate. So when we look at the private aspect, this power is basically visible, is displayed visibly, and it's mostly exercised by the government, its agencies, its leaders, in the corporate or the nonprofit spheres. In terms of private, if you look at, it's basically expressed within the social institutions. So when we talk about, families, marriages, friends, or other relationships, it comes under the private realm. And in terms of intimate, it basically talks about yourself. It talks about you, within you. It talks about power or powerlessness that we have over ourselves when we talk about self-esteem, self-confidence, or control over our own bodies. So this has basically been drawn or inspired by the work done by Vene Klassen and Milken, who are one of the theorists, who are one of the 2 scholars who have come up with this concept. And when we look at the 3 faces of power in the next slide, I think I'll just explain the picture here. I think like when we're looking at the picture in the earlier slide, there's a scientist who is claiming that there's this climate change, but there are climate denial saying that, is there a science? There can be alternative science, and climate change basically is a hoax. So that these are the narratives which are being pushed by the global north, particularly the United States, right? And how it basically influences the global scenario when we talk about climate change is particularly important to understand. So when we look at the dimensions of power, or the three phases of power, it's basically divided into three components, which is visible, hidden, and invisible. When we talk about visible, it's basically held by those with decision-making power and who have control over resources or people and information. So for example, it can be government officials, it can be policymakers, it can be political leaders, military, police, judiciary, MNCs, trade unions, civil society organizations as well. But I think like these last 2 points are particularly important when we talk about hidden power, which basically sets the political agenda. The ability is such that they will be consulted behind the curtains, even before the decisions are made. So they can be fundamental lobbyists, right? Where the government or the representative of government might reach out to them and make the decision. So they have that hidden power to influence that ways. So even within home, if you see, women might be acting to confirm that she is a good woman, right? So what is being operationalized within home is how patriarchy is functioning for her to claim that she's a good woman and therefore she needs to do da 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 da. So the third point is invisible, which basically is really important to understand. It shapes, this invisible power shapes people's belief, sense of self, and acceptance. So if you look at, for example, if you look at media and marketing agencies, how advertisements are put out to make you believe that you're not enough, that your body is not good enough, that fairness cream should work for you if you're not satisfied with yourself, with your own skin tone or your complexion. So that is how it actually plays out, the culture and tradition as well. It plays out in an invisible way and influences people's belief. So if you look at the next slide, we talk about the goals of feminist leadership. So what are the goals of feminist leadership is to basically challenge this visible, hidden, and invisible power, and wherever it operates to basically construct or reinforce women's subordination, which furthers discrimination against women. And the second point was included previously, but I'll say it again because this is important, because feminist leadership actually strives to make the practice of power visible, democratic, legitimate, accountable at all levels, at both public and private realms. So that is, it's really important. And the other aspect of power analysis, which we really need to understand, is in the next slide, where we talk about expressions of power. So how do we express our power? So in the next slide, you can see we look at power over, and which might be very familiar for many of you when we talk about authoritarian government, where the powerful is basically exerting their power on the weak, where there's so many communities, groups of people who are excluded from the mainstream. So that is what power over is, and we should basically pay attention to this one, where we need to hit this power over, so that no one is excluded, no one is threatened for their lives. So in terms of power too, it's really important to understand this aspect, where we're basically looking at individuals' capacity to decide for themselves. So when we talk about agency and capacity to act comes under power too. So in terms of power width, it's basically the collective power through movement, organization, solidarity, joint action. So even Power Shift Nepal, they're already a collective of youth. So there's already power with this particular group, right? To make an action. I also saw in one of the posts that there was a statement against oil drilling. So, there's this power with the movement. And this is where we should put our energies in. How do we put our energies in to form collective, how they can challenge the main narratives which are there, dominant narrative which are there. The other aspect is power within, which basically talks about within you, you know, your self-confidence. It is basically linked to different aspects of your identity or your religion or your culture. And this also talks about your sense of empowerment, you know. So I think like there needs to be more investment in this aspect as well when we talk about power. The other one is power under, which not many people talk about, and I think like this needs to be talked about a lot. So what does it basically mean? It's mean that once you're in control, once you assume that power, what you do is you assume the power and you start exercising your decision with your own discretion, meaning, so previously you might be powerless. Now you've become powerful because you've gained a formal authority. And you also start functioning like a dictator, you know. So there's this problem. So you need to counter that. And particularly there's this one example from the Zanzibar experience, which is mentioned in the toolkit itself, where there was this feminist convening in Tanzania. And there was conflict within the women's rights group. There was backbiting and whatnot. And people were clueless in terms of like why this is happening. Where is the problem? You know, why are we bickering here? And we could already see that, you know, being a feminist collective, you're actually challenging the power inequalities, you're actually demanding for equality. And here people are actually, you know, fighting for power. You're demeaning the other person, humiliating the other feminist from other countries. So there was this sudden realization saying that, okay, in this convening, we are not going to achieve what we intended to achieve. But what we can definitely do is that we can have a principle, you know, with us. So they had a set of principles with them. So in slide number 15, if you go and see, it talks about deep-seated myths. No, the earlier slide. The deep-seated myths that we talk about is within feminist organization. People think that, you know, once you're a feminist organization, they will naturally lead differently because they are women. You know, they'll share power more readily or equally. They're all women, so they don't really have to worry about power within the organization of movement, or the organization won't be oppressive, exclusionary, or undemocratic. That the organization will be flat and you know, because they don't believe in hierarchy, everyone is equal there. Or, you know, they won't be reproduction of patriarchal organizational forms, or you know, there will be more accountability in place. Or, you know, we're already practicing accountability in the movement. So basically, we don't really have to be concerned about accountability. So these are the popular myths within feminist organizations and also about feminist organizations that we can see, right? So, but what we need to understand is we are also informed by our own values, our own principles, you know, our own experiences. So that is going to influence how we behave, what we say, how we act, what we decide. So that aspect is really important. And we go to another aspect of for peace, which is principles and values. So if you go to the other slide, where we look at principles and values. So when we talk about values, you know, like leadership does not occur in a moral or social vacuum, right? So it is always informed by values. And values are the ethical norms that guide our behavior, and principles are norms that guide our action. So that is the difference. And most of the principles, you know, the principles are basically derived from these values. हाम्रो मूल्य मान्यताबाट चाहिँ सिद्धान्त भनौँ न is basically inspired or derived. And the value dimension is therefore, it's important when we talk about feminist politics, and values and principles can be our non-negotiables that feminist leaders and the organizations will protect and advance. So it is important, to have those non-negotiables in place, to agree on them. Otherwise, the experience of Zanzibar will be repeated, right? So even if, like there's a group within Power Shift Nepal, we are operating in troops, but there might be some conflict. But how do we come together as a collective is that we can have certain values and principles that is set aside and which will be our non-negotiables to move forward to where we are aiming to go. The another slide where you can see is, basically what particularly can principles and values mean. Values can be equality, inclusivity, diversity. And when we talk about climate change, I think it's also important to talk about self-determination when we talk about, a right to self-determination of indigenous community where they are the closest to the nature. And in terms of principles, it can be different for different community, but one of the few principles that we can see here in feminist movement is the person is political, biological is not destiny, peace and security, bodily integrity, right? So if we look at the other aspect, I think like the politics also becomes really important for us when we talk about leadership, right? And what is the purpose behind feminist leadership? So we go to the next slide to understand politics and purpose, which is the third P here. So one of the key components of feminist leadership that we can see is politics and also the nature of mission, like purpose that guides it. So when we talk about politics, it basically means analysis of socioeconomic realities, and that can inform our own ideological lens, and that basically informs our analysis, right? And purpose is something long-term vision or mission for change, and which can emerge from our own politics. So what we need to see is the channel, the way it moves, is that we might have our own politics, and which is really important. Otherwise, it won't be called a feminist leadership, right? So that political standpoint is really important to have. And to have that ideological lens is another layer that should be there. And it will inform our own practice on feminist leadership. And it will be pushed by our own political agenda that we've been pursuing for, right? So that is how it is connected. So if you look at leadership development, therefore it therefore should bring to the surface and equip people to basically articulate their own politics and purpose in clear and conscious ways. What basically leadership development is, what feminist leadership is, and what is our politics. It needs to be defined, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be done consciously, right? So we go to the fourth component, which is practices. And if you look at the leadership development modules, manuals, which has been practiced so far, most of them have been disconnected from power, politics, and principles and values. So if that disconnect is there, then it can't be a feminist leadership. There needs to be a connection of all these four together when we are practicing transformative feminist leadership. And when we're looking at our own skills, our abilities, they are informed by values and politics, right? So we need to be conscious of how our practice can converge with other P's, which are power, principles, and politics. And if you look at one of the examples, it might be Young Feminist in Climate Change initiative, where they might feel that they're marginalized and they don't feel comfortable, where there are people, distinguished guests or delegates from different countries. Are they being patronized? Are their knowledge and expertise being valued, or they're being patronized, right? So these components should be dissected and converged at the same time. Dissected to understand the concept, but to converge in our practice. And we should be clear that we're not going to reproduce the existing gaps again. And that's why I think like there are already few programs, looking at multi-generational approaches, even within climate change agenda. So when we go to next slide, time पनि भन्दैन ल मलाई कति भयो भने यादै होइन. Next slide. So when we talk about the role of self in leadership, I think it's really important. So we looked at the kite, right? So if you need to fly the kite, there needs to be a string attached to it. And the string needs to be attached to an individual so that it can fly, right? So what we can see is that it is anchored in individuals. One can lead individually or collectively. It depends, right? But it needs to be shaped and transformed by the self. So you are there as an individual. And our own experiences can influence our own decisions and our practice in leadership development, like I said before, when we assume power and authority. So the example that I gave of Zanzibar experience or the young feminist, in climate change action, it's really important for us to understand ourselves within these 4P. So it's important to understand how we examine power and grow that awareness towards social transformation, and begin the transformation at the individual level. And that's why I think like this slogan is particularly important. The personal is political. Next slide, please. So even within the self, when you bring self within the feminist leadership diamond, there are different aspects which influences your decision, your practice. And when we talk about, personality, self-esteem, someone can feel insecure when you assume position of authority. You can get threatened by other people's competency. So it's also about your own personality and self-esteem. There can be history and experience as well, where you have experienced power in positively or negatively, which can shape your attitude and your understanding. So that history becomes also important, which can generate insight and skills. So there can be personal social capital contacts as well, where you have networks, support systems, which can influence your position, talent, abilities, inclination. So everyone has that unique package that individual brings to leadership. So you might have charisma, you might have personality that can, you can be talkative, you can be friendly. So everyone has different skills and abilities that ways. So I would say everyone has that capacity and package, so you don't think that you don't have that power in itself. And in terms of identities as well. So, and there are multi-layered identities. I think it's really important to look at this aspect as well, where our thinking, our perspective is being continuously shaped by different institutions, socialization process, our experiences of like where we stay in, how these patriarchal structures are informing our own experiences. And mostly if you see, women are not comfortable holding powers, okay? I know you're very comfortable holding it indirectly. Meaning, for example, how many of you are, like women are comfortable sitting in the front seat if you're in a meeting, right? Or how many of you are naturally inclined to sit in the first, front chair? त्यो गाडीमा पनि अगाडि बस्दाखेरि चाहिँ अगाडि बस्नुहुन्छ कि पछाडिको ब्याक सिटमा गएर बस्नुहुन्छ त? Where do you sit? So naturally, where you're inclined, what you're taught. So I think like that also becomes really important in terms of how we can transform our deep-seated, thinking that is there. And if you don't do that, if you don't have self-awareness, then we can't even think about empowerment and liberation and act for change, right? So we go to next slide. So the other site is like, where is it? Where can we basically find it? Is that, you know, their locations, their family, clan, caste, tribe, community, the state, the market and private sector, you know, civil society, women's rights movement and other social movements, cultural and religious institutions. The first one is primary site where feminist leadership is mostly practiced, right? The second one is traditionally targeted, you know, the state, and they also efforts to bring out enabling mechanism, just a gender budgeting ola, just a formation of National Women's Commission ola, right? To bring out climate policy ola. The market and private sector, I think it's really interesting to look at this aspect where they've gained a significant foothold. And why I say that is, you know, slowly they have co-opted the whole concept of feminist leadership. You know, it has been instrumentalized and advanced in corporate to achieve corporate and market goals. So they've been very efficient with it. And civil society women's rights movement is something that we're very comfortable with. It's a familiar site for us where we've experimented different leadership styles. And I think like still the most critical sites of engagement that needs to happen for transformation is cultural and religious institutions, because gender discrimination is embedded, right? Is embedded in cultural and religious institutions, and how we can reconstruct this is something that we might want to look at and want to challenge. So the last part is feminist ways of leading. So Srilata Batliwala, like, she reached out to different you know, feminist leaders from throughout the world, and they had something similar to share. You know, what would feminist ways of leading look like? Vanda Hari saying these are the things that they said. You know, they basically look at gender power relation. They would put that at the center. They would have transformative agenda. You know, they would be resilience. They would infuse feminist leadership in every job that they do, in every location. And this also requires risk taking, right? So when we talk about women human rights defenders who are particularly looking at environmental risk and crisis, most of the women human rights defenders who have been murdered have been an environmentalist or environment activist, you know, so there is risk taking. So there's ability to influence agenda. So you're not just like leading individually, but you're basically leading collectively. And like I said, you know, feminist leaders are not really comfortable holding power, and that also needs to be looked at and challenged. The value of collective and multi-layered leadership. It's not one way or top-down process. It's also about leadership, relationship building. It can be about nurturing, and it can be looked at positively as well, and not just be looked at negatively. It can be about empowerment, transformation of women. You know, there should be introspection, there should be innovation within the organizations and their practices. And looking at the last slide, I think I'll wrap up now. I think I've taken too much time. You know, I think like the way forward us can be to premise ourselves within the climate change context and see, you know, how we can recognize women's knowledge, you know, and their existence basically, and indigenous women's traditional knowledge. We need to place love, care, and self-determination at the center. Had we done that before, you know, climate change would not have occurred. And I strongly feel that there can be no climate justice without gender justice, and there can be no gender justice without climate justice, vice versa. And we need to change the climate narrative through transnational solidarity, and also see how global can be localized, and also, you know, local can be globalized, is something that I have to say. And I'm I think like this is what I have to share. Thank you so much for your time. And if there are any questions, then I would be really happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Kripaji, for this wonderful insight. I think we all have learned many things from you. What is leadership and how it is power, how we have to utilize our power, and different aspectहरू चाहिँ हामीले तपाईबाट आज सिक्न पायौं। अनि अब चाहिँ हामी क्वेशन एन्सर सेसनतिर लाग्छौं। अनि तपाईं पार्टिसिपेन्ट्सहरूलाई कुनै क्वेशन या क्वेरी छ भने चाहिँ च्याट बक्समा लिभ गरिदिँदा पनि हुन्छ, नत्र भने चाहिँ हजुरहरूले इभन अनम्युट गरेर सोध्दा पनि हुन्छ।
एउटा मलाई पर्सनल क्वेशन चाहिँ पठाउनु भएको रहेछ यासिका लम्सालजीले। त्यो क्वेशन लिउँ कि तिनजेलसम्म अरू क्वेशन आउँछ कि?
हुन्छ।
So question चाहिँ के भन्नुभएको छ भन्दा नि how someone can be part of this leadership भनेर भन्नुभएको छ हैन। So mainly I feel that यो leadership को कुरा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ हामीले आफै नै हाम्रो आफ्नो स्टाइल के छ कस्तो छ हैन। We need to understand ourselves basically हैन, our own location where we operating from, and see how we can start practicing the concept in itself. We might have already done it, right? Your concept it has actually brought together the practices of feminist leaders from so many years before. And kaka gap chha your gap cha त्यसै कारणले चाहिँ this is how we can move ahead भन्ने हिसाबले चाहिँ फ्रेम गरिएको यो डायमन्ड हैन। त्यसै कारणले how can we more conscious when we're practicing leadership? And कति जनाले त के भन्नु होला, म त लिडरै जस्तो लाग्दैन, I don't think that I'm a leader because I'm not leading any organization, or I'm not a leader because I don't consider myself a leader. I think that I'm a follower भन्ने खालको पनि कतिवटा कुराहरु चाहिँ आउने हुन्छ। But I think in different contexts, in different scenarios, you have to take that leadership role हैन। लिनु पनि भएको छ होला when you're taking the decision for yourself, when you assert that okay, I have my right, ma Power Shift Nepal ko yo meeting ko लागि जाँदैछु, and you're deciding for yourself and also making your voice visibilized. So I think like your engagement pani outlet pani hunu paryo, but at the same time I think like we need to be more aware of these concepts conceptually pani. The conceptually matter tha bhayera bhaina, then again it needs to be practiced pani. So it's basically how we can complement each other. Ani part hunu bhanda pani I think it's in you. Tapai कसैको कुनै leadership को part हुने भन्दाखेरि पनि it's about you. It's about you practicing the leadership skills. In fact, I hope I answered your question, Yasika ji.
Kripa ji, I have a question, Sagarika. Okay, presentation ma चाहिँ तपाईले जुन मेन्सन गर्नुभयो नि women leadership र feminist leadership को चाहिँ slightly difference छ भन्ने कुरा, अनि त्यसपछि feminism अनि त्यसपछि feminist leadership मा पनि थोरै difference छ। हो त्यो difference चाहिँ हामीलाई अलिकति example सँगै दिनु भयो भने चाहिँ सायद अलि सुनिराख्नु भएको सबै participants लाई पनि अलिकति helpful हुन्थ्यो होला understanding also मलाई।
हजुर definitely यो aspect चाहिँ किन differentiate गर्न important छ भन्दाखेरि, so when we're talking about women leader or women leadership or feminist leadership भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ women हुने बित्तिकै feminist हुन्छ भन्ने पनि छैन हैन। So I think like that needs to be understood पहिला सुरु त। अनि women भन्ने बित्तिकै चाहिँ women leadership भन्ने बित्तिकै तपाई women भएर lead गरिराख्नु भयो होला, but you might not have any political standpoint के हैन। तपाईको आफ्नो politics सायद म चाहिँ equality को लागि खडा भएको भन्ने खालको छैन होला। Maybe you also supporting patriarchy हैन। त्यो पितृसत्तात्मक सोचका साथै तपाई त्यही स्ट्रक्चरमा त्यसलाई नै सपोर्ट गरेर त्यसलाई नै पानी दिने त्यसलाई मलजल गर्ने हिसाबले पनि काम गरिराख्नु भएको छ होला है। So महिला नेत्री भनौं न, महिला नेतृत्व र हाम्रो नारीवादी नेतृत्वमा चाहिँ त्यो डिफरेन्शिएट गर्न चाहिँ I think it's really important. So the politics aspect चाहिँ त्यो डिफरेन्शिएट हुने भयो हैन। अर्को चाहिँ फेमिनिन र फेमिनिस्ट लिडरशिप को बारेमा कुरा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ फेमिनिन भनेको चाहिँ जस्तै एउटा त्यो क्वालिटी हो हैन तपाईको, एन्ड फेमिनिन भनेको तपाईको त्यो महिला पुरुष दुवैमा हुन सक्छ। It might not need be khali mahilama matra hunनुपर्छ. So it's basically a quality that is there in people. अनि त्यसमा पनि अब फेमिनिन हामीले भन्छौँ नि masculine हो feminine हो अनि धेरै जस्तो leadership भन्ने बित्तिकै के भनिन्छ हामी धेरै जस्तो चाहिँ example एकचोटि if you think in your head हैन example दिमागमा सोच्यो भने चाहिँ leadership भन्ने बित्तिकै कसको दिमागमा को आउँछ हाम्रो इमेज दिमागमा हैन basically a man हैन सायद ढाका टोपी दौरा सुरुवाल लगाएको man हैन पहाडी man हुन सक्छ. So we already have that image in our head. कसरी चाहिँ त्यो dominant narrative कसले चाहिँ push गरिरहेको छ भनेर. त्यो leadershipमा पनि तपाईले हेर्नु भयो भने अनि हामीले qualities सोध्यो भने leaders को हाम्रो मुखबाट के निक्लिन्छ होला. So we would say that they need to be assertive, हैन they need to be एकदम decision making गर्ने खालको quality हुनुपर्छ होला. So त्यसमा हामीले भन्ने qualities haru the characteristics haru धेरै जस्तो masculine हुन्छ के हैन धेरै जस्तो and we basically discard feminine aspect जहाँ चाहिँ सायद हाम्रो leadership practice मा feminine aspect पनि जरुरी छ हैन where we talk about nurturing aspect where we talk about care where we talk about basically being हामीले distinction गर्छौं नि breadwinner and caretaker त्यो खालको त्यो distinction जुन चाहिँ छ त्यो distinction चाहिँ feminine र masculine मा हुने भयो हैन तर when we talk about feminine and feminist leadership भनेपछि again to feminist leadership भनेको चाहिँ त्यसमा चाहिँ political clout हुने भयो यो चाहिँ तपाईको जसले पनि practice गर्न सक्नु भयो men or women हैन अनि तपाईको यो feminine भनेको it's more to do with acting like someone who practices femininity. त्यो aspect मा जान्छ कि जबकि feminist leadership भनेको चाहिँ it basically talks about that political clout तपाईको purpose के हो त्योतिर जान्छ. So I think like people get confused with the word in itself feminine र feminist त्यो चाहिँ हामीले I think like त्यो distinction चाहिँ गर्न जरुरी छ because feminine does not mean feminist and feminist does not mean feminine and feminist भन्ने बित्तिकै feminine नै हुनुपर्छ भन्ने छैन हैन they can be masculine as well. So I think like there needs to be a distinction and clear understanding on this होला सायद.
Thank you कृपाजी अनि हामीसँग अर्को क्वेशन पनि आएको छ च्याटमा म पढेर सुनौ.
हजुर मैले हेरेछु हजुर.
Is it really necessary to talk about the feminism prior to the gender equality in our society भनेर सोध्नु भएको छ.
So यो हामीले यो concept हैन यो चाहिँ एकदम इभल्भ भएर आएको concept पनि हो हाम्रो सोसाइटीमा अनि कति त्यो प्र्याक्टिस गरेर पनि अनि कसले चाहिँ त्यो कोइन गरे हो किन कोइन गरे हो त्यो कन्सेप्ट हैन अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ के ग्याप्स छ त्यो ग्याप्सलाई पूरा गर्नको लागि अरु कुनै कन्सेप्ट आएको छ कि हैन जस्तै फर एक्जाम्पल तपाईको इको फेमिनिस्ट हैन अब हामीले चाहिँ अब यो क्लाइमेट जस्टिस इन्भाइरोन्मेन्टको कुरा गर्दा चाहिँ इको फेमिनिस्टको हामी कुरा गर्छौं इको फेमिनिस्ट किन आउनु पर्ने जरुरी थियो होला त हैन आई थिंक लाइक इट्स रियली इम्पोर्टेन्ट फर अस टु अल्सो अन्डरस्ट्यान्ड दैट कि किनकि फेमिनिज्म भनेकै के हो भनेर चाहिँ आई थिंक लाइक दैट नीड्स टु बी डिकन्स्ट्रक्टेड पहिला त हैन किनकि फेमिनिज्मको अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङ भएपछि बल्ल जेन्डर इक्वालिटी हुन्छ भन्ने खालको अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङ छ कि के छ किनकि तपाईले हेर्नु भयो भने मोस्टली ग्लोबल वेमा हेर्नु भयो भने पनि जेन्डर इक्वालिटी इज मोर इजिली एक्सेप्टेड वर्ड देन फेमिनिज्म और फेमिनिस्ट अहिले पनि फेमिनिज्मलाई चाहिँ डराएर हेर्ने गरिन्छ हैन ब्रा बर्निङ फेमिनिस्ट हो कि रेडिकल फेमिनिस्ट हो कि यो फेमिनिस्ट हो कि त्यो फेमिनिस्ट हो कि भन्ने खालको चाहिँ एउटा डर हैन त्यस्तो नाजी फेमिनिस्ट हो कि भन्ने खालको चाहिँ एउटा डर चाहिँ नट जस्ट इन सिभिल सोसाइटी अर्गनाइजेसन्स बट इभन विदिन गभर्नमेन्ट पनि छ त्यो कुरा चाहिँ त्यसै कारणले I would ideally want people to be aware about feminism के भन्ने हो भने चाहिँ किनकि that would bring in that the politics wala component pani in people kati jana might just like stand for haina हामी चाहिँ equal हुनु पर्छ भन्ने छ तर you don't really have that political clout to make that stand के or to stand for it हैन जस्तै मैले इकोफेमिनिजम को कुरा भनिरहेको थिएँ इकोफेमिनिजम पनि किन आउनु परेको थियो त त्यसो भए भन्ने खालको पनि अब त्यो एउटा क्वेशन छ भने यसले त हाम्रो हैन यो इन्भाइरोन्मेन्टको कुरा गर्ने हो भने जुन चाहिँ डिग्रेडेसन भइरहेको छ मान्छेले एक्सप्लोइट गरिरहेको छ यो क्यापिटलिजम हैन त्यो क्यापिटलिस्ट स्ट्रक्चरले गर्दाखेरि त्यसले त दुवैलाई इम्प्याक्ट गर्यो नि हैन नेचरलाई पनि इम्प्याक्ट गर्यो त्यो वुमेनलाई पनि इम्प्याक्ट गर्यो भनेपछि यो दुईटालाई त हामीले सेपरेट गरेर हेर्न सक्छौँ कि सक्दैनौँ त सक्दैनौँ होला देयर इज अ कनेक्सन बिट्विन बोथ हैन बिट्विन द एक्सप्लोइटेसन एन्ड डिग्रेडेसन अफ द नेचर and the subordination and oppression of women भन्ने हिसाबले चाहिँ यो 1970s तिर चाहिँ यो कन्सेप्ट पनि आयो र यो अहिले पनि फेमिनिजमको कन्सेप्ट पनि इभल्भ भइरहेको छ हैन देयर डिफरेंट काइन्ड्स अफ फेमिनिजम्स हैन खाली फेमिनिजम मात्र छैन फेमिनिजम चाहिँ छ अनि अहिले जस्तै ट्रान्स फेमिनिजम भयो किनकि मेनस्ट्रिम फेमिनिस्ट मुभमेन्टले कतिजना वुमेन फ्रम द मार्शलाइज्ड सेक्सन हैन कम्युनिटी उहाँहरूको कुरा चाहिँ समेट्न नसकेको कारणले पनि यो अरु फेमिनिजमहरु आएको जस्तै हामीले पनि भने नि मैले भने नि रिक्लेमिङ नरेटिभ्स भनेको चाहिँ इन्टरसेक्सनल फेमिनिस्ट कलेक्टिभ हो भनेर भन्यो सो इभन त्यसमा पनि किन त इन्टरसेक्सनल फेमिनिजमको कुरा गर्नुपर्ने छ त भन्दाखेरि कतिजनाको कुरा अहिले पनि छुटिरहेको छ कि जबसम्म हामीले त्यो इन्टरसेक्सनल लेन्स हैन लाएर हामी हेर्दैनौँ स्टिल जोसम्म हामी पुग्न पर्ने हो सायद त्यो मान्छे चाहिँ छुटेकै हुन्छ सो टु आन्सर योर क्वेसन सेमान्तिजी आई थिङ्क फेमिनिजम चाहिँ आई थिङ्क शुड हेभ आइडली कम बिफोर जेन्डर इक्वालिटी बट अहिले के भइरहेछ भन्दाखेरि सटली जेन्डर इक्वालिटीकै बारेमा धेरै कुरा हुन्छ फेमिनिजम खासैको बारेमा चाहिँ त्यति कुरा हुँदैन कम्फर्टेबली चाहिँ कुरा हुँदैन हजुर
धन्यवाद कृपाजी जस्ट मलाई यदि हामी फेमिनिजम अथवा म एज अ फेमिनिस्ट भयो भने म जेन्डर इक्वालिटी एज अ कम्पोनेन्ट मानेर म त्यसमा वकालत गर्न सकेँ एम आई राइट
हजुर एकदमै हजुर एकदमै त्यही आई थिङ्क त्यही कन्सेप्ट त्यही नै हो हैन सो बेसिकली वाट इज फेमिनिजम भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ त्यसले त त्यही भन्ने हो नि त हामीले बेसिकली हामीले के खोजिरहेको छौँ भन्दाखेरि इक्वालिटी नै खोजिरहेको हो किन भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ अहिलेसम्म हामी ओप्रेस्ड भइरहेछौँ अहिलेसम्म पेट्रियार्कीले हामीलाई थिचिरहेको छ त्यसै कारणले चाहिँ we want feminism and once you consider yourself as a feminist I assume that you're going to practice gender equality in different spheres of your work and your life also.
Thank you.
Thank you Kripaji once again अब हामीसँग अर्को पनि एउटा क्वेशन छ I'll read it. In context to Nepal, what is the status of female and how can we bring the change in people participation towards the women leadership अथवा feminist leadership भन्ने question आछ एउटा
यो I think like यो एकदमै important question पनि हो हैन किनकि हामीले हेर्यौं भने there's so many barriers के for women especially in Nepal हैन अनि the impact of climate change has been so disproportionate on women particularly हैन अनि त्यो impact of climate change चाहिँ it's not neutral okay gender neutral छैन नि अनि यसलाई चाहिँ बढाउनको लागि केले मद्दत गरिरहेछ भने डिफरेंट सोशल रोल्स हैन जुन चाहिँ हाम्रो कल्चरल नर्म्सले डिटरमाइन गरेको होला आवर ओन जेन्डर डिभिजन अफ लेबर हिस्टोरिकली रुटेड प्र्याक्टिसेस होला पावर स्ट्रक्चर्स अनि इनइक्वालिटीज हैन डिफरेंट काइन्ड्स अफ इनइक्वालिटीज हाम्रो आफ्नो यो क्लाइमेट चेन्जको कन्टेक्स्टमा हेर्ने हो भने धेरै जस्तो अहिलेको प्र्याक्टिसेसमा अहिले पनि वुमेन आर बेसिकली लुक्ड एट एज अ विक्टिम के त्यो विक्टिमको लेन्सले हेरिरहेको छ धेरै जस्तो why I say that is to image case of it's basically a population who's dependent on someone else भन्ने खालको चाहिँ इमेज बनाइएको छ हैन अनि त्यो इमेज त्यो narrative चाहिँ we need to change because women can be agents of change or they are agents of change किनकि एग्रिकल्चरमा तपाईले हेर्नु भयो भने mostly they're women you know and then especially यो climate change ले गर्दाखेरि पनि कति आउट माइग्रेसन भएर पुरुषहरु बाहिर जानु परेको छ अनि त्यसको भार कामको भार चाहिँ महिलाहरुमा निकै परेको हामीले देखेका छौं नेपालमा चाहिँ and which has increased their unpaid work हैन एक्सपोनेन्शियली धेरै नै बढेको छ अनि त्यो त्यो डिस्क्रिमिनेसन चाहिँ धेरै इन्टर्नलाइज पनि भएको छ वुमेनहरुमा सो हाउ डु वी इन्करेज वुमेन टु गेन लाइफ स्किल्स पनि इज समथिङ द्याट आई वाज थिङ्किङ अबाउट किनकि अब यो क्लाइमेट चेन्ज हैन यो क्लाइमेट नेचुरल क्यालामिटिज भयो भने चाहिँ do women have that life skills to climb trees or to swim कति त्यो हाम्रो पहिलादेखिको सोशलाइजेसन प्र्याक्टिसले पनि के गर्दो रहेछ भन्दाखेरि women are discouraged to learn these life skills के अनि कतिवटा नेचुरल क्यालामिटिज बीट पहिलाको त्यो सुनामी हैन श्रीलङ्का यहाँ हाम्रो आफ्नो कति फ्लड्स आउँछ ल्यान्डस्लाइड हुन्छ त्यस्तो खालको केसेसहरुमा चाहिँ वुमेन र चिल्ड्रेनहरु नै धेरैले ज्यान हैन उहाँहरुको ज्यान जाने गरेको छ सो आई थिंक लाइक these are like अलिकति एकदम इन्टेन्स एकदम स्ट्रक्चरली गार्डेड भएको कुरा छ भने हाम्रो अब बेसिकली भन्दाखेरि वुमेन चाहिँ फोर फ्रन्टमै भएर काम गर्नु भएको छ हाम्रो नेपालमा हैन एन्ड पर्टिकुलरली यो मुभमेन्टलाई अगाडि बढाउनलाई चाहिँ इन्डिजिनियस वुमेनहरुको धेरै कन्ट्रिब्युसन पनि छ अनि हाम्रो आफ्नै देशले पनि अब एसडीजीज लाई इन्डोर्स गरेको छ सीडा लाई राटिफाई गरेको छ हैन अनि पहिला नै बीजिङ डिक्लेरेसन एन्ड प्लेटफर्म फर वुमेन प्लेटफर्म फर एक्सन 1995 मै आई थिंक लाइक द फर्स्ट थिङ दैट इट वाज आइडेन्टिफाइड वाज दैट वुमेन एन्ड इन्भाइरोन्मेन्ट को कुरा चाहिँ ल्याउनु पर्छ भनेर 12 क्रिटिकल एरियाज अफ कन्सर्नमा पनि परेको हो सो नेपालले चाहिँ इन अ वे इट हैज मेड दोज कमिटमेन्ट्स के है नेपालले त्यो कमिटमेन्ट पनि गरेको छ अनि इन्टरनेशनल कमिटमेन्ट पनि गरेको छ सो वी क्यान बेसिकली प्रेसराइज दैट वुमेन सिचुएसन शुड बी इम्प्रुभड एन्ड हाउ इट क्यान बी इम्प्रुभ कतिवटा अहिले क्लाइमेट हैन ग्रीन क्लाइमेट फन्ड भनेर पनि राखिएको छ जहाँ चाहिँ इट इज सपोज टु बी जेन्डर फ्रेन्डली अनि हाम्रो युएन फ्रेमवर्क कन्भेन्सन अन क्लाइमेट चेन्ज ले म्यान्डेट पनि गरेको छ दैट जेन्डर मेन स्ट्रिमिङ हुनुपर्छ हैन जेन्डर ग्लोबल इन्भाइरोन्मेन्ट फेसिलिटीमा ग्रीन क्लाइमेट फन्ड पनि हुनुपर्छ भनेर भनिएको छ र अब एउटा एस्पेक्ट पनि हाम्रो मिनिस्ट्रीले चाहिँ अब मिनिस्ट्री अफ साइन्स एन्ड टेक्नोलोजी एन्ड इन्भाइरोन्मेन्ट हैन पहिला चाहिँ यसले नेशनल इन्डोर एयर क्वालिटी स्ट्यान्डर्ड एन्ड इम्प्लिमेन्टेसन गाइडलाइन भन्ने एउटा चाहिँ ल्यायो अनि यसमा चाहिँ इट हेज emphasize on gender friendly environment in the household okay so for example improved cooking stoves होला ventilation राम्रो हुनु पर्यो होला भने but यो खालको orientation खाली महिलालाई मात्र दिएर त भएन नि त हैन yes women primarily might do cooking हैन घरमा तर उहाँलाई मात्र दिँदाखेरि त we also again perpetuating the same gender roles that is there saying that वुमेनले नै यो रोल गर्न पर्ने हो भन्यो नेपाल कम्पेरेटिभली अरु ठाउँ भन्दा चाहिँ अलिकति अगाडि नै छ किनकि 2011 मै क्लाइमेट चेन्ज पोलिसी लिएर आएको हो हैन अनि जेन्डर स्ट्र्याटेजी एन्ड एक्सन प्लान पनि अब त्यसमा काम गरेर भने सुनेको थिएँ त्यो हिसाबले चाहिँ आई फिल नेपालबाट चाहिँ एक्सन्स भइरहेको छ but I think the most important thing that we need to look at is whether that is being localized or not okay and whether the movement that is happening on the ground is being visibilized or not त्यो पनि अर्को कुरा हो which we might want to talk about हजुर
अब हामी अलिकति ढिला भइसकेको छौँ टाइम भन्दा त्यही भएर एउटा च्याटमा एउटा क्वेसन आएको छ निरज साम्राकारजीले सोध्नु भएको छ आई हर्ड फाइटिङ प्याट्रिआर्की वी निड टु फाइट ब्राह्मण प्याट्रिआर्की थिङ्किङ एन्ड कास्ट बेस्ड डिस्क्रिमिनेसन हाउ दिस क्यान बी एड्रेस भन्नुभएको छ आई हर्ड दिस लाइन एस्टरडे इन वान प्रोग्राम
हजुर I think like यो त हामीले पहिले नै गर्नुपर्ने कुरा हो हैन but I think like I'm glad that this is being discussed अनि यही कुरालाई अगाडि बढाउनको लागि पनि हाम्रो दलित फेमिनिस्टहरुले यो कुरालाई अगाडि बढाउनु भएको छ हैन ब्राह्मणिकल पेट्रिआर्की भनेर and why does it need to be looked at भन्ने खालको पनि कुरा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ when we're talking about caste based discrimination who is the dominant group, who is actually practicing caste-based discrimination भन्ने एस्पेक्टमा चाहिँ हामी जानुपर्छ कि जस्तो लाग्छ। त्यसको जडा कहाँ छ, त्यसको रुट कजेस कहाँ छ त भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ it is just not caste that we need to fight. It is also caste and gender, हैन, त्यसभित्र पनि तपाईको अरु components, अरु intersections पनि आउन सक्छ. So I think like we need to move ahead from just looking at things from one lens and look at it from intersecting lens. जहाँ चाहिँ खाली caste based discrimination लाई address गर्नलाई हामीले caste को lens ले मात्र हेरेर पुग्दैन, हैन, यसलाई चाहिँ हामीले caste, gender को हिसाबले पनि हेर्नु पर्यो, because the impact of caste based discrimination on Dalit women, if you see, हैन, अहिलेको recent cases हरु पनि भएको तपाईहरुले देख्नु नै भएको छ, सुन्नु नै भएको छ. So how could that be prevented, हैन? त्यसमा I think like the different lenses to it can also come to class होला. Class पनि त्यसमा add हुन सक्छ, maybe regional भनौं न हाम्रो geographical location पनि हुन सक्छ होला. So which is being added, हैन? It is adding to the oppression and exploitation. त्यसै कारणले चाहिँ Brahminical patriarchy, yes, and that needs to be talked about to address caste-based discrimination. Yes, I agree with what you've said, Neeraj ji. के भन्नुभयो सागरिका जी?
ए हैन, please go on.
ए हजुर, त्यो क्वेशन मलाई के जस्तो लागेको थियो, हैन रहेछ? हजुर, I think I've responded. हजुर,
एउटा क्वेशन अर्को पनि आएको छ, म रिड गरेर सुनाउँछु, हैन. Can you provide example of innovative and transformative local and grassroots level initiatives that address these priority issues related to the gender and climate change भन्नुभएको छ? यसको आन्सर गरिदिनु हुन्छ?
फेरि भन्नु त, अलि चाँडो भन्नुभयो. Innovative and transformative initiatives.
Can you provide example of innovative and transformative local and grassroots level initiative that address these priority issue related to the gender and climate change?
जस्तै तपाईको एउटा मैले हेर्दै गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ, हैन, तपाईको लोकली एकदमै राम्रो काम भइरहेको छ, हाम्रो आफ्नो फेमिनिस्ट ग्रुप्सहरुले पनि गरिराख्नु भएको छ, हैन. बट द थिङ इज के चाहिँ भिजिबल हुन्छ कि मेन स्ट्रीममा आउने खाली काम भन्दैनौ, धेरै जस्तो विडम्बना चाहिँ त्यो छ भनौं न. अनि हाम्रो आफ्नै नेपालमा पनि national adaptation plans भनेर आएको छ, हैन. यसले चाहिँ जेन्डरलाई क्रस कटिङ थीमको हिसाबमा लिएको छ. अनि यसले गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ अहिले vulnerability and risk assessment framework पनि बनाउनु पर्छ with different gender and diversity indicators. So which is a good progress, I think. अनि यसमा जस्तो हाम्रो अब कतिवटा खालको काम त भइरहेको छ, हैन. त्यसमा पनि कतिवटा कामहरुमा चाहिँ जस्तै नेपाल क्लाइमेट चेन्ज सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम भन्ने भित्र पनि लोकल लेभल एडाप्टेसन प्लान्स एक्सन भनेर बनाइयो, लापा भनेर, हैन. त्यसले चाहिँ हाम्रो इन्स्टिट्युसनमा पनि जेन्डर प्यारिटी हुनुपर्छ है. बेनिफिशियरी हेर्दाखेरि पनि वुमेनहरु कति हुनुहुन्छ हेर्नुपर्छ है. क्यापासिटी बिल्डिङमा धेरै इन्भेस्ट गर्नुपर्छ है. टार्गेट प्रोग्राम्सहरुमा पनि अब वुमेनहरुलाई फोकस गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने खालको चाहिँ त्यसमा कुरा आएको हो, हैन. तर हाम्रो धेरै जस्तो क्लाइमेट चेन्ज इनिसिएटिभहरुमा चाहिँ धेरै जस्तो हामी खाली एडाप्टेसनको मात्र कुरा गर्छौं, क्यापासिटी बिल्डिङको मात्र कुरा गर्छौं when we talk about women, हैन. त्यतिबेला मात्र लिमिट गर्छौं. And women are actually missing from issues around mitigation, technology, यो एस्पेक्टहरुबाट चाहिँ अहिले पनि, अनि फाइनान्स, यो एस्पेक्टबाट चाहिँ अहिले पनि महिलाहरु चाहिँ मिसिङ हुनुहुन्छ यो कन्भर्सेसनमा. So even for, I think, like Power Shift Nepal, going forward, like how can we also talk about or bring gender issues, when we're talking about mitigation, finance and technology is something that you might want to look at. अनि एउटा मैले लोकल इनिसिएटिभ एउटा देखाएको थिएँ, हाम्रो एक्सन रिसर्च गर्नु भएको उहाँहरूले चाहिँ, हैन. जहाँ चाहिँ त्यो भनौँ न गाई बस्तुहरूलाई चराउनको लागि चाहिँ स्टप ग्रेजिङ इनिसिएटिभ भनेर उहाँहरूले गरिराख्नु भएको छ होइन। एउटा चाहिँ यो उदयपुरमा चाहिँ हाम्रो चेतना समूह भन्ने, चेतना महिला समूह भन्ने, उहाँहरूले त्यहाँ चाहिँ अब एक्सटेन्सिभ ओभरग्रेजिङ भयो होइन। कति त क्लाइमेट चेन्ज इस्युज भनेको हामी कतिजना यहाँ नन भेजिटेरियन छौँ होइन। यो यसले चाहिँ कसरी त्यसलाई क्लाइमेट चेन्जलाई कन्ट्रिब्युट गरिरहेछ भन्दा त्यो ओभरग्रेजिङ भएको कारणले पनि होइन, त्यसले चाहिँ धेरै प्रब्लमहरू निम्त्याउन सक्ने। एन्ड प्लस यो जुन अर्गनाइजेसन हो उहाँहरूले चाहिँ धेरै जस्तो इम्ब्याङ्कमेन्टमा काम गर्ने, त्यहाँ चाहिँ फ्लड आउने अनि आफ्नो जग्गा जमिनमा पनि धेरै जस्तो चाहिँ बालुवा भइसकेपछि उब्जाउ काम हुन नसके पश्चात चाहिँ उहाँहरूले के गर्न सकिन्छ भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ एउटा चाहिँ उहाँले स्टप ग्रेजिङ मुभमेन्ट पनि गर्नुभयो, जहाँ चाहिँ लोकल वुमेनहरूलाई चाहिँ कलेक्ट गरेर त्यो मुभमेन्ट नै गरेर अलिकति अवेरनेस कसरी बढाउने अनि लोकल गभर्मेन्टसँग कसरी मिलेर काम गर्ने भन्ने भयो भने। अर्को चाहिँ उहाँहरूको आफ्नो घुम्ती गोष्ठी पनि गर्नुहुन्छ, जस्तो मुभेबल होइन मिटिङ भयो, एउटा ठाउँमा मात्र नभइकन अब कहाँ हुनुहुन्छ त व्यक्तिहरू उहाँहरूसँगै पुग्ने हिसाबले चाहिँ काम गर्ने। अनि उहाँहरूले लोकल नेचुरल रिसोर्स म्यानेजमेन्ट एन्ड ग्रिन ग्रोथ कमिटी भनेर पनि फर्म गर्नुभयो, जहाँ चाहिँ उहाँहरू आफै ग्रिनेरी डिफेन्डर ग्रुप भनेर फर्म गर्नुभएको छ। अनि बेसिकली यो क्लाइमेट चेन्जको बारेमा चाहिँ कुराहरू उठान गर्ने, कसरी चाहिँ उठान गर्न सकिन्छ। अनि त्यो खोलाको होइन त्यो इम्ब्याङ्कमेन्टमा पनि यु वुड डु प्लान्टेसन, कसरी चाहिँ नेक्स्ट इयर इट्स नट गोइङ टु फ्लड ओर सबै त्यो स्यान्ड चाहिँ नआओस् भनेर। सो यो इनिसिएटिभ आई थिङ्क कतिजनालाई थाहा पनि हुँदैन होला होइन नेसनल लेभलमा, तर यो यस्तो खालको इनिसिएटिभ हाम्रो वुमेनहरूले लोकल लेभलमा गरिराख्नु भएको छ कि। एन्ड आई थिङ्क लाइक वी निड टु बेसिकली गिभ मोर स्पेस for their recognition as well in terms of how they're supporting grassroots women's movement for sustainable strategies to reduce the impact of climate change.
Thank you, Kripa ji. अब एउटा फेरि लास्ट क्वेसन पिक गर्छौँ अनि हामी सेसनको एन्डमा जान्छौँ। Last question चाहिँ, do you think our policies are in the support of women leadership, and do you think it is practiced well from the government to local bodies or even from the अरू पिपुलहरूबाट पनि?
हजुर, अहिलेसम्मको प्र्याक्टिस तपाईँले हेर्नुभयो भने इट्स मोस्टली टोकनिस्टिक होइन। अहिलेसम्मको रिप्रेजेन्टेसन आएको कारण चाहिँ it's because of the feminist movement building. We need to be thankful to people who fought for us होइन, जसले चाहिँ रिस्क लिएर हामीलाई यहाँसम्म ल्याउनु भयो, and we were able to get these policies. So we need to be thankful about that. तर त्यो भन्दा भन्दै हामीले एउटा कोटा सिस्टम भनेर ल्यायौँ अनि त्यसमा अब महिलाहरू त आउनु भयो, बट त्यो structurally need to change भएन भने we're basically repeating and perpetuating the same inequalities no matter where they are. Okay, so representation छ होइन तपाईको, तर again meaningful participation छ कि छैन भन्ने खालको पनि हामी I think like this is the word होइन, meaningful participation छ कि छैन। And what do we mean by meaningful participation भन्दाखेरि उहाँहरूले voice out गर्ने ठाउँ छ कि छैन त होइन। उहाँहरूले voice out गरिसके पछाडिको उहाँको कुरालाई सम्मानका साथ अगाडि लिएर गइन्छ कि गइदैन त। So round the table if there are only 2 women and the rest of the people are men होइन, कुन चाहिँ एजेन्डा अगाडि बढ्छ। अनि कतिवटा टाइममा स्पेशली अहिले कोभिड-19 को तपाईँले पनि कुरा गर्नुभयो भने कति त आफ्नै डिस्क्रिप्सन इन्डिभिजुअल डिस्क्रिप्सनमा पनि कुरा भएको छ। कतिवटा यो हामी महिला नेत्रीहरू चाहिँ लिडरशिप रोलमा आउनु भयो भनेर खुसी मान्छौँ होइन। मैले चाहिँ पोलिटिकल लिडर्सहरूको इलेक्टेड लिडर्सहरूको बारेमा कुरा गर्दैछु, खुसी भयौँ। तर अब मैले आफैले इन्टरेक्ट गर्दाखेरि पनि, मैले आफ्नो काममा इन्टरेक्ट गर्दाखेरि पनि उहाँले के भन्नु भन्दाखेरि मैले काम गर्दाखेरि पहिला सोशल एक्टिभिस्ट काम गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ मेरो बुढाले होइन, मेरो हस्बेन्डले चाहिँ एकदम सपोर्ट गर्नुहुन्थ्यो, फ्यामिलीले सपोर्ट गर्ने। तर मैले यो इलेक्सनमा जितेर आउने बित्तिकै चाहिँ के भयो भन्दाखेरि मैले चाहिँ हिंसा बेहोर्नु पर्यो घरबाटै हैन सो द भाइलेन्स अगेन्स्ट वुमेन घरभित्र नै त्यो डोमेस्टिक भाइलेन्स चाहिँ मैले खेप्नु पर्यो किन भन्दाखेरि त बढी भइस् त जान्ने भइस् भन्ने खालको पनि उहाँले चाहिँ त्यो एक्सपिरियन्स गर्नु पर्यो दि अदर एस्पेक्ट इज उहाँले चाहिँ अर्को वुमेन लिडरले के भन्नुभयो भन्दाखेरि मैले चाहिँ यो जितेर आएँ एकदम खुसी छु तर म यो हाम्रो मिटिङ हुन्छ त्यो मिटिङमा आउनलाई पनि मैले मेरो बुढासँग पैसा मागेर आउनुपर्छ बिकज महिला मेम्बरहरूले पैसा पाउनुहुन्न भनेर भन्नुभयो केही गरिदिनु पर्यो म्याम भनेर भन्दै हुनुहुन्थ्यो उहाँले होइन अब मैले मेरो हातमा त केही छैन त्यो तर एउटा तपाईँको सोसल क्यापिटल त बढ्यो इन टर्म्स अफ पोजिसन होइन मैले गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने खालको पनि छ अहिले झन् COVID-19मा त सबै जिम्मेवारी नै उहाँहरूको माथि खनिएको छ सो वी क्यान सी द्याट वुमेन होइन जहाँ चाहिँ वुमेनको राम्रो रिप्रेजेन्टेसन भएको छ त्यहाँ क्वारेन्टाइन फेसिलिटिजहरू राम्रो भएको छ सो इफ यु सी त्यो पाटोमा चाहिँ इट डज मेक अ डिफरेन्स इफ इट इज बिङ लेड बाई अ वुमन होइन बट नट नेसेसरली अलवेज किनकि त्यो पेट्रिआर्कल ब्यागेज चाहिँ मान्छे पछि इट माइट बी डिफरेन्ट त्यो खालको अवेरनेस त्यो टाइपको कन्सियसनेस पनि त्यो सबैमा हुन्छ कि हुँदैन भन्दाखेरि पनि we can't really guarantee but what we can guarantee is how do we ensure that we create safe spaces for women to grow as a leader हैन खाली आफू मात्र लिडर मात्र भएर भएन कि how do we create environment to grow new leaders भन्ने पनि I think like it's something that we might want to look at जुन चाहिँ पावर शिफ्ट नेपालले पनि गरिराख्नु भएको छ हैन and thank you for that I think like म त्यति नै भनौँ होला हजुर
थ्याङ्क यू सो मच कृपाजी अनि यहाँ यति धेरै एन्सरहरू पनि गरिदिनु भयो हामी कति कुराहरूमा चाहिँ अलिक धेरै क्लियर भयौँ जस्तो लाग्यो यो टपिकमा अब सिन्स वी आर अलरेडी एट द एन्ड अफ द प्रोग्राम अनि आई वुड लाइक टु कल मिस सागरिका भट्टर टु टेक अ फ्यु मिनट्स फर आवर सिन्थेसिस सागरिका भट्टरजी
थ्याङ्क यू सुमना कृपाजी थ्याङ्क यू सो मच तपाईँले हामीलाई टाइम दिएर चाहिँ आउनुभएकोमा मलाई चाहिँ फ्यु थिङ्स अबाउट पावर शिफ्ट नेपाल त्यो चाहिँ अगाडि राख्न चाहन्छु अनि अल्सो अन फ्यु थिङ्स द्याट वी डिस्कस्ड अनि कृपाजीले केही कुराहरू चाहिँ हामीलाई अलिकति क्ल्यारिफाई गरिदिनु भएकोमा पनि चाहिँ धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद किनकि हाम्रो टिमलाई चाहिँ आई थिङ्क इट्स भेरी नेसेसरी टु अन्डरस्ट्यान्ड फ्यु थिङ्स जुन चाहिँ आज अलिकति आई थिङ्क एज अ टिम पनि अनि एज पार्टिसिपेन्ट्सहरू आउनु भएकोलाई पनि आई थिङ्क इट वाज अ भेरी गुड सेसन यहाँ पावर शिफ्ट नेपालमा चाहिँ हामीले के गर्छौँ भन्दा बेसिकली हामीले पावर शिफ्ट नेपालमा चाहिँ यङ फिमेल लिडर्सहरूलाई चाहिँ अगाडि लिएर आउनलाई एन्ड अल्सो मैले कास्टको कुरा यहाँ किन आउँदैन हाम्रो पावर शिफ्टमा भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ वी डोन्ट सी कुन कास्टको को मान्छे हो वी डोन्ट बिलिभ कि यो कास्ट ब्राह्मण अथवा यो कास्ट यो भएर चाहिँ ऊ चाहिँ आउन पाउँदैन वी डोन्ट सी द्याट त्यो कारणले गर्दाखेरि कास्टको कुरा चाहिँ हामी वी डोन्ट फोकस तर एज फिमेल वी इन जेनरल हामी सबै फिमेललाई इक्वली हेर्छ र इन जेनरल वी ट्राई टु क्यापेसिटेट त्यो फिमेल ग्रुप्सहरू जो चाहिँ हामीसँग आउनुहुन्छ र हाम्रो थ्रु चाहिँ उहाँहरूले टेक्निकल र लिडरसिपको चाहिँ ट्रेनिङ्सहरू लिएर होइन क्यापेसिटेट गर्न चाहिँ चाहनुहुन्छ र त्यो क्रममा चाहिँ हामीले उहाँ फिमेलहरूलाई नै यङ फिमेलहरूलाई नै लिएर चाहिँ हाम्रो कम्युनिटिजहरूमा चाहिँ हामीले अरू वुमेन ग्रुप्सहरू होइन त्यो वुमेन ग्रुप्समा पनि डिफ्रेन्ट लाइक हामीले वुमेनहरूलाई पनि चाहिँ क्याटेगोराइज गरेको हुँदैन जो पनि इन्ट्रेस्टेड हुन्छ जो पनि निडी हुनुहुन्छ त्यो लिडरसिपको लागि जो पनि इच्छा जागिर गर्नुहुन्छ होइन उहाँहरूलाई चाहिँ हामी अगाडि बढाउँछौँ र यो चाहिँ हाम्रो चाहिँ मोस्ट प्रोबेबली हाम्रो ग्रुपले चाहिँ यङ फिमेल्सलाई चाहिँ फोकस गरेर उहाँहरूको लिडरसिप बिल्ड गरेर क्लाइमेट जस्टिस र इन्भाइरोमेन्टल इस्युजमा चाहिँ बिल्ड गरेर हामीले चाहिँ त्यो क्यापेसिटी र स्किललाई चाहिँ अरू लार्जर मास होइन युथ चिल्ड्रेन र वुमेनको बिचमा चाहिँ उहाँहरूको लिडरसिपलाई चाहिँ अगाडि लान्छौँ र हामीले त्यो मात्र नभएर चाहिँ हामीले उहाँहरूलाई चाहिँ एउटा प्लेटफर्म पनि दिन्छौँ जहाँ चाहिँ उहाँहरूले आफ्नो लिडरसिपलाई चाहिँ एक्सप्लोर गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ इन द फर्म अफ हुन्छ नि अब क्याम्पेन्स हुनसक्छ अरू एक्टिभिटिजहरू हुनसक्छ त्यो पनि हामीले प्लेटफर्म दिएको छौँ र एभ्री इयर हामीले अलमोस्ट अहिलेसम्म कुनै टाइममा चाहिँ 15 अथवा कुनै टाइममा 20 कुनै टाइममा 12 गरेर चाहिँ हामीले एभ्री इयर फिमेल्सहरूलाई यङ फिमेल्सहरूलाई चाहिँ लिडरसिप को ट्रेनिङ र क्यापेसिटेट चाहिँ गरेको छौँ सो आजको कृपाजीको सेसनमा चाहिँ हामीले के बुझ्न पायौँ भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ लाइक अघि नै पनि मैले पनि क्वेसन सोधेको थिएँ वुमेन लिडरसिप र फेमिनिस्ट लिडरसिपको डिफ्रेन्स होइन उहाँले फेमिनिस्ट लिडरसिप भनेको चाहिँ एउटा पोलिटिकल स्ट्यान्ड पोइन्ट भएको हुनुपर्छ सेल्फ स्टिम अनि स्किल र रिसोर्सेसले चाहिँ त्यसलाई चाहिँ मोर डिफाइन गर्छ भन्नुभयो होइन यो डिफ्रेन्सेसहरू चाहिँ आज लर्न गर्न पाएको छौँ अल्सो चाहिँ फेमिनिस्टको भ्याल्युज र आइडियोलोजिजहरू के हुन्छ र पावर भनेको डिफ्रेन्ट फर्म्स अफ पावर चाहिँ एक्चुअली आज आई थिङ्क सबैले पनि रियलाइज गर्छ होला वी नेभर थट त्यो डिफ्रेन्ट फर्म्स अफ पावर त्यसरी पनि हामीले क्याटेगोराइज यो फिल्डमा लाग्नु भएको हरूलाई चाहिँ अभियसली थाहा छ तर नयाँ मान्छेहरूलाई चाहिँ यो यस्तो फर्म्स अफ पावर पनि हामीले यसरी क्याटेगोराइज गर्दो रहेछ भन्ने कुरा पनि हामीले आज लर्न गर्न पायौँ अल्सो फर पिस पावर पोलिटिक्स प्र्याक्टिस प्रिन्सिपल्स एन्ड भ्याल्युज यसलाई चाहिँ एज अ फेमिनिस्ट लिडरसिपको चाहिँ डायमन्ड भनेर पनि एउटा स्ट्रक्चर यस्तो हुन्छ भनेर पनि हामीले बुझ्यौँ र यही सँगै चाहिँ कृपाजीलाई के भन्न चाहन्छ भन्दाखेरि पर्सिफ नेपाल टिम आई थिङ्क हाम्रो टिममा चाहिँ मोस्ट हाम्रो फिमेल लिडरसिप नै छ सो त्यो कारणले गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ आजको सेसन एज अ टिम एज सबैजना हामीहरू प्रेजेन्ट भएकोबाट चाहिँ हामी तपाईँलाई धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद भन्छौँ अल्सो कमिङ डेजमा चाहिँ इफ पोसिबल भयो भने चाहिँ हाम्रो किनकि आई थिङ्क देयर इज मच मोर टु अन्डरस्ट्यान्ड यो बाहेक पनि यो त सानो सेसन भयो होइन मच मोर टु अन्डरस्ट्यान्ड र हामीले सायद यसलाई अझ डेप्थमा चाहिँ प्र्याक्टिसमा हामीले एज पावर सिफ्टिङले चाहिँ प्र्याक्टिसमा लिएर आउनलाई हामीले कसरी यसलाई हामीले प्लान गर्न सक्छ अझ फ्युचरको लागि भनेर चाहिँ सायद यो कुरामा पनि हामीले चाहिँ कृपाजीसँग कन्सल्ट गर्नेछौँ र तपाईँको आजको सेसनको लागि एज पावर सिफ्ट नेपाल टिमको तर्फबाट हामी सबैको तर्फबाट चाहिँ थ्याङ्क यू भेरी मच सुमना
थ्याङ्क यू सागरिका दी अनि अल्सो थ्याङ्क यू फर कृपाजी यहाँ आइदिनु भयो आफ्नो टाइम दिएर हामीले कति कुरा लर्न गर्न पायौँ के लर्न गऱ्यौँ भनेर त अघि सागरिका दीले पनि भन्नुभयो अनि त्यसरी नै अरू धेरै कुरा पनि होप विल लर्न from you in coming days. Also at the end, I would like to thank you from the whole PowerShift team and also thank you for giving us this insightful knowledge. Also at the end, I would like to thank all our participants for your constant support throughout this session. अनि हजुर कसैलाई केही क्वेरीज अथवा केही क्वेसनहरू छ केही जान्न मन छ भने चाहिँ पावरसेफ्टको इमेलमा मेल गरेर यु क्यान आस्क है अनि मैले पावरसेफ्टको इमेललाई पनि यही च्याट बक्समा लिभ गरेको छु सो यति भन्दै आजको सेसन चाहिँ हामी यही एन्ड गर्छौँ थ्याङ्क यू
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.